My stepmother poisoned my father against me for 15 years, and I only found out after she died. I wasn't there when my father passed away. My stepmother, Catherine, didn't even call me. At his funeral, she was cold toward me, saying, "You wouldn't have come anyway." But when I collected my father's belongings, I found a voicemail on his phone that he never sent to me, recorded 3 days before his death. His breathing was labored, but his voice was clear. "Ryan, my son, I did you a terrible injustice. Catherine did everything to drive you away from me. You're getting kicked out of university, the arguments between us, it was all her plan. Now that I'm dying, I understand how manipulated I was. I love you so much," and the voice cuts off. There's a second message. "If you're hearing this, look under my bed for the box. All the evidence is there." When I opened that box, my name is Ryan Mitchell. I'm 29 years old, and for most of my adult life, I believed my father James had stopped loving me. Catherine came into our lives when I was 14, 2 years after my mother died in a car accident. She was charming, attentive, and seemed to genuinely care about both my father and me. At least, that's what I thought. The change was gradual. Small things at first. Catherine would mention how disrespectful I'd been when my father wasn't around, or how I'd rolled my eyes during dinner conversations I barely remembered having. She'd sigh and say, "I'm sure he doesn't mean it, James. He's just going through a phase." But the phase never ended, according to Catherine. Every normal teenage behavior became evidence of my declining character. Every B+ became proof I wasn't trying hard enough. Every time I chose to hang out with friends instead of family dinner became an example of how little I valued our family unit. My father, grieving and lonely, found comfort in Catherine's constant presence and apparent wisdom. She'd been through this before, she claimed. She had experience with difficult teenagers from her previous marriage. She knew how to handle situations like this. By the time I was 16, the warm, loving relationship I'd had with my father had transformed into something cold and transactional. Conversations became interrogations. Achievements were dismissed with faint praise. Mistakes were analyzed and cataloged as part of a concerning pattern. The worst part was that I could see my father pulling away, but I didn't understand why. I tried harder in school, spent more time at home, attempted to engage him in the activities we used to enjoy together. Nothing worked. If anything, my efforts seemed to irritate him more. "He's being manipulative," I once overheard Catherine tell him. "All this sudden good behavior is just because he wants something. Trust me, I've seen this before." When I was 18 and preparing for college, Catherine suggested I might benefit from a gap year to mature and figure out what I really wanted. My father agreed. When I finally started at Riverside University a year later, Catherine convinced him I should pay my own way. It'll teach him responsibility and the value of education. I worked 3 jobs to afford tuition and living expenses. My grades suffered. When I was placed on academic probation sophomore year, Catherine was there with the perfectly timed "I told you so" conversation that pushed my father to cut off all financial support. "Maybe this is what he needs to grow up," she told him. "Some people have to learn the hard way." I dropped out junior year, crushed by debt and failure. My father's disappointment was palpable during our last real conversation. "I had such high hopes for you," he said, shaking his head. "Your mother would be so disappointed." Those words destroyed me, not just because of the failure they represented, but because I could see that he genuinely believed I had let him down. The loving, supportive father who had raised me for 14 years was gone, replaced by someone who saw me as a burden and a disappointment. I moved across the country, got a job in construction, and slowly rebuilt my life. We spoke maybe twice a year after that. Awkward phone calls on holidays where Catherine was always in the background, monitoring and managing the conversation. Ryan called, I'd hear her say as I was hanging up. Same old Ryan, always wanting something. But I wasn't always wanting something. I was just wanting my father back. The box under my father's bed contained 15 years of evidence that my entire adult relationship with him had been built on lies. There were printed emails dating back to when I was in high school. Messages I'd sent my father about achievements at school, plans for college, expressions of love and respect. But there were also Catherine's responses to him about these same emails. Responses that painted everything I'd written in the worst possible light. When I'd written, Dad, I got into the Honor Society. Can't wait to tell you about it, Catherine had responded to him privately. Did you see how he's bragging again? This kind of arrogance is exactly what I'm worried about. When I'd sent a heartfelt email about missing my mother on the anniversary of her death, Catherine's interpretation to my father was, he's trying to make you feel guilty. He knows mentioning your wife gets to you emotionally. Every genuine attempt I'd made to connect with my father had been systematically reframed as manipulation, disrespect, or emotional blackmail. And my father, trusting the woman he loved, had believed every word. But the emails were just the beginning. Catherine had kept detailed journals of our family interactions, documenting every conversation, every meal, every moment of conflict. Reading through them was like seeing my adolescence through a funhouse mirror. Everything distorted and malicious. Ryan was sullen at dinner again tonight. Read one entry from when I was 16. He barely spoke and seemed resentful of every question James asked him. I'm concerned about his attitude toward authority figures. I remembered that dinner. I'd been quiet because I'd just learned that my girlfriend had broken up with me, and I was trying not to cry in front of them. But to Catherine, my normal teenage emotional processing had been evidence of fundamental character flaws. The most damaging entries were the ones where Catherine documented her own manipulations as if they were necessary interventions. James was starting to soften toward Ryan after his good report card. So I reminded him about the incident with the broken window last month. It's important that James doesn't reward Ryan's basic expectations without addressing the larger pattern of behavior. Ryan asked James for help with his college application essay. I suggested that James make Ryan work with a tutor instead. It's important that Ryan learns independence and doesn't rely on his father to solve his problems for him. Every attempt I'd made to rebuild our relationship had been intercepted and reinterpreted. Catherine had positioned herself as the voice of reason, the concerned stepmother who could see through my supposed manipulations because she wasn't blinded by parental love. The cruelest discovery was a series of letters my father had written to me over the years, but never sent. Hidden in the bottom of the box, they told the story of a man who desperately missed his son, but had been convinced that reaching out would only enable bad behavior. My dear Ryan, read one from my sophomore year of college. I know things have been difficult between us, but I want you to know that I love you and I'm proud of the young man you're becoming. Catherine thinks I shouldn't interfere with your learning process, but my heart tells me to call you every day. Another from after I dropped out. I failed you somehow, and I don't know how to fix it. Catherine says giving you money or support now would only enable your pattern of giving up when things get hard. But I remember the little boy who never gave up on anything. And the most heartbreaking, from just 6 months before his death. I dream about you sometimes, Ryan. In my dreams, we're fishing like we used to when you were small. And you're telling me about your day. And I'm listening like I should have listened more when you were growing up. I miss you so much. But Catherine is probably right that calling you now would only confuse things. I sat on my father's bedroom floor, surrounded by 15 years of evidence that the woman I'd trusted to care for him had instead systematically destroyed our relationship for her own purposes. She hadn't just manipulated me out of the family. She'd manipulated him into believing it was necessary for his own good. My phone rang. Philip Anderson, my father's attorney. Ryan, I'm calling about your father's will. There are some irregularities we need to discuss. But the biggest shock hidden in that box was yet to come. Philip Anderson's law office felt like a courtroom as I sat across from him with the box of evidence at my feet. Catherine sat beside me, her face a mask of composed grief, playing the role of the bereaved widow perfectly. There are concerns about the will, Philip began carefully. James made several changes in the months before his death, and some of them are unusual. He slid documents across the table. The will had been rewritten 4 times in the past year. Each version gave Catherine more control and me less inheritance. The final version, signed just 2 weeks before my father's death, left me with almost nothing. The concerning part, Philip continued, is that James asked me specifically about mental competency requirements for will changes. He seemed worried about someone influencing his decisions. Catherine's composed mask slipped slightly. James was confused toward the end. The medication made him paranoid. Actually, I said, opening the box, I think he was more clear-minded than anyone realized. I spread the evidence across Philip's desk, the emails, the journals, the unsent letters, the voicemails. Catherine spent 15 years systematically manipulating my father against me. She documented her own manipulations in these journals. Philip's expression grew grave as he reviewed the materials. Catherine's face had gone pale. These journals. Philip muttered, reading Catherine's own words. You were deliberately interfering with their relationship. That's taken out of context, Catherine said quickly. I was trying to help James set appropriate boundaries with a difficult child. I played my father's final voicemail on speaker. His voice filled the room. Catherine did everything to drive you away from me. It was all her plan. I understand how manipulated I was. The silence that followed was deafening. Philip cleared his throat. Catherine, I need to ask you directly. Did you influence James's decision-making regarding his will? I supported him in making decisions that were best for his future security. She replied carefully. By lying to him about his son's attempts to communicate with him? I asked, pulling out printed emails. By telling him I was manipulative when I was just trying to maintain a relationship with my father. You were manipulative, Catherine snapped, her composure finally cracking. You were a constant source of stress and disappointment. James was happier without your drama. He wrote letters to me for 15 years, I said, holding up the unsent correspondence. He missed me every day. You convinced him not to send them. Philip was taking notes furiously. Catherine, These journals document a systematic campaign to alienate a father from his son. The legal term for this is alienation, and it can be grounds for challenging a will if it influenced the testator's decisions. "Are you threatening me?" Catherine asked. "I'm informing you," Philip replied. "Based on this evidence, Ryan has grounds to contest the will. But there's something else." He pulled out another document. "James left specific instructions with me. If evidence ever emerged that someone had manipulated him regarding his family relationships, there were provisions to be activated." Catherine went rigid. "What provisions?" "A secondary will. One that Catherine knew nothing about because it was filed separately with my firm." Philip opened a sealed envelope. James suspected something wasn't right in his final months. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he asked me to prepare a backup will that would protect Ryan's inheritance if it ever came to light that he'd been manipulated. The secondary will restored my inheritance and included a letter from my father. If you're reading this, it means my suspicions were correct, and someone close to me was interfering with my relationship with my son. Ryan, please forgive an old man who loved you but was too confused to see the truth clearly." Catherine stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. You can't prove any of this." "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone. Catherine kept recordings too. I'd found her phone in the box, along with hundreds of voice memos she'd made to herself over the years. Audio documentation of her manipulation strategies, recorded like a twisted personal journal. I played one from 5 years ago. "James is starting to ask questions about why Ryan never calls. I need to remind him about the credit card incident and maybe suggest that Ryan is probably just calling when he needs money." Another, "James found an old photo of him and Ryan today and got sentimental. I hid it while he was in the shower. It's important that he doesn't dwell on the past." And the most damning? Ryan sent James a birthday card. I intercepted it and told James that Ryan forgot his birthday again. The disappointment on James's face was exactly what I needed to reinforce, that Ryan doesn't care about him. Philip stared at Catherine in disbelief. "You intercepted birthday cards?" "You recorded yourself manipulating a grieving widower," I added. Catherine's carefully constructed facade crumbled completely. "You don't understand. I loved your father. I was protecting him." From what? From his son's love? From disappointment? From being used? You were just like every other selfish teenager, and you would have broken his heart eventually anyway. "So you decided to break it for me?" The room fell silent except for Catherine's ragged breathing. Philip cleared his throat. "Catherine, I strongly advise you to consult with your own attorney. This evidence suggests possible fraud, elder abuse, and interference with family relationships. There may be criminal implications." 6 months later, I stood in my father's workshop behind the house, surrounded by tools he'd taught me to use when I was a boy. Catherine had moved out within weeks of our confrontation with Philip, and the house had been transferred to me as per my father's secondary will. The criminal charges against Catherine were still pending. Elder abuse, fraud, and interference with a family relationship. Her recorded confessions made the case straightforward, according to the prosecutor. She'd fled to another state, but extradition was only a matter of time. But the legal victory felt hollow compared to what I'd really lost and found. I'd lost 15 years with my father. 15 years of birthdays, holidays, achievements, and ordinary conversations that could never be recovered. I'd lost the chance to introduce him to the woman I'd eventually married, the opportunity to ask his advice about career decisions, the simple pleasure of his company as I grew from a confused teenager into a confident adult. But I'd also found something unexpected, proof that he'd never stopped loving me. I spent hours reading through his unsent letters, listening to voice memos he'd recorded for himself about missing me, studying photos he'd kept hidden from Catherine showing our happiest moments together. The father I remembered from childhood, loving, supportive, proud, had never really gone away. He'd just been buried under layers of manipulation and lies. The workshop had become my refuge. Catherine had banned my father from talking about me here, but she'd never thought to clean out his private workspace. I found sketches of woodworking projects he'd planned to teach me, newspaper clippings about my construction company that he'd apparently been collecting, and a half-finished photo album labeled "For Ryan" that documented our entire relationship from my birth through age 14. The last page had a note in his handwriting. "Someday, I hope we can add to this together." My phone rang. Samuel Torres, my father's oldest friend. "Ryan, I owe you an apology." "Sam, you don't owe me anything." "Yes, I do. I knew something was wrong. Your father used to talk about you all the time in the early years after Catherine arrived. He'd light up whenever your name came up. But gradually, those conversations became more painful for him. He'd mention something you'd done, and Catherine would interpret it differently." Sam's voice was heavy with regret. "I should have said something. But I thought it was just normal family adjustment. Blended families are complicated, and Catherine seemed to have James's best interests at heart. You couldn't have known how systematic it was. I should have trusted my instincts. The James I knew would never have cut his son out of his life voluntarily. The fact that he did should have been a red flag." After Sam hung up, I continued organizing my father's workshop. Hidden behind a stack of lumber, I found one more surprise: a fully completed rocking chair with my name carved into the headrest. A note attached read, "For Ryan's first child. Built with love and hope for the future. Dad." I sat in that chair and wept for the grandfather my future children would never meet, for the relationship Catherine had stolen from us, and for the man who'd spent his final years believing his son didn't love him. But I also wept with gratitude. Despite everything Catherine had done, despite 15 years of manipulation and lies, my father's love for me had survived. It had been buried, misdirected, and twisted into something painful, but it had never died. In his final weeks, when illness stripped away the confusion and manipulation, his true feelings had emerged. The voicemails, the secondary will, the box of evidence, they were his way of reaching across the divide Catherine had created and telling me the truth. I called my wife Sarah and told her about the rocking chair. "Bring it home," she said simply. "Our daughter should have something made by her grandfather." 3 weeks later, our daughter Emma took her first nap in that rocking chair. As I watched her sleep, I thought about the generational cycle of love that Catherine had tried so hard to break. She'd succeeded in stealing years from my father and me, but she hadn't succeeded in destroying what we meant to each other. Sometimes the people closest to us can cause the deepest damage, not through dramatic betrayals, but through slow, steady manipulation that rewrites the story of our relationships. Catherine had spent 15 years rewriting my story with my father, turning love into disappointment, hope into suspicion, and connection into distance. But in the end, truth has a way of surfacing, even from beyond the grave. Would you have forgiven your stepmother? Or would you have pursued justice to the fullest extent